The story of Andreas continued in the Maple Leaf dormitory of the Golden Academy, which could be used by the students free of charge. It was an old, beautiful building that may not have looked as luxurious as the academy itself, but was still well maintained. Andreas was a very minor villain in the actual game, and now that one was stuck in his body, they realized how weak he truly was. Sitting on his bed, he looked outside, contemplating how he could barely manage basic elemental magic. Therefore, his abilities as a necromancer were the only thing he could rely on. That's why he had chosen the evolution trait to further support and expand his necromancy. Andreas stood up, grabbed his cloak, and decided to make a quick detour to the underground laboratory before continuing his mission and going to the cemetery to fetch a new body for his teacher. He couldn't afford to waste any more time. He was determined to become stronger as quickly as possible, not just for the next event, but also to be better prepared, as there were many characters who could kill him besides his master. He walked through the door leading to the underground laboratory and glanced at some books with unusual titles. These books were meant to teach him dark necromancy. Andreas knew that if he were to be discovered with just one of these books, it would mean instant death. However, he also knew that something else could mean his immediate demise. And he looked back into the lab where a person was caged. It was a semi-naked woman with red-orange hair, bound to the wall inside the cage. Andreas knew she was a vampire. Vampires in this world were unaffected by sunlight and could also wield very powerful magic. They were not a species that Sharon could easily obtain. Andreas thought about how she was roughly on the level of a mid-game boss. Suddenly, the vampire spoke to him, causing Andreas to turn around. The vampire asked if he wouldn't help her escape. A train swiftly passed over a bridge, and due to the speed of the ride, the city in the background was only fleetingly visible. Andreas sat on this train, contemplating the conversation with the vampire, which seemed very enticing to him. He believed it to be a heaven-sent gift, a stroke of luck in his favor. The vampire promised that if Andreas were to set her free, she would kill Sharon for him. She also asked if he wasn't afraid that Sharon would eventually kill him first. Andreas hadn't expected anything less and knew that the vampire had read his thoughts when he was focused on the books. In that moment, he had been so careless and hadn't acted like Andreas. The vampire appeared quite serious in this situation because she knew it was her only chance to escape and make Sharon pay for imprisoning her. Andreas told her that if he were to set her free, there would be no guarantee that she wouldn't harm him as well. In response, she swore not to kill him. She repeated this a few times, but had a sly grin on her face. Andreas wondered if a high-ranking being like a vampire would keep promises made to mere mortals. He looked down at her incredulously, questioning whether he should really believe her. Additionally, Andreas pondered if it was too soon to betray his teacher directly and whether it could cause further problems in the current timeline. The vampire, on the other hand, told him that there was no time to consider the matter but urged him to set her free now. However, Andreas wanted to conduct further research to learn more about vampires. He knew that there was a book about them somewhere. The train continued its journey and had now reached a tunnel, which it passed through. Meanwhile, the next stop was announced, the National Cemetery, with Hearthfell Station as the stop. Gasping for breath, Andreas dragged a suitcase behind him as he walked the final stretch to the cemetery. Completely out of breath, he realized that everything would be easier if he had money, but for now, he had to rely on good old physical strength and hard work. He looked at the entrance gate to the cemetery and knew that this was where all the black mages obtained their corpses. Andreas spoke to the guard who was watching the gate, claiming that he came from Jenny's house and was the third grandson. The guard asked if he had brought flowers. Andreas confirmed this and said that he had brought 13 azure sky irises, successfully gaining access to the cemetery. Luckily, he remembered the password from his previous game time. He continued dragging the suitcase and encountered an older man who was taking a short break from digging up a corpse. He recognized Andreas and told him that he had perfect timing and had come at the right moment. He showed Andreas the corpse he had just unearthed, which was the corpse of a knight, as previously agreed upon with Sharon. The knight held a golden sword in its arms. The man told Andreas to take it or leave if he wasn't satisfied. Andreas was somewhat overwhelmed by the situation but thanked the man and took the corpse. With his weak body, he tried to carry it into his suitcase. Having barely managed, he was ready to head back before it was too late. But as he sat panting and exhausted over his suitcase, he noticed a grave adorned with a beautiful tombstone. Several candles stood on it, and flowers were placed as well. Andreas felt as though he had seen the name on the tombstone before and suddenly recognized it. He also remembered where he had seen it. It was the name Nicol Lifehill, and this man was an aura master. Nicol was someone who had spent years training in complete isolation to follow the path of the sword. He trained until his hair and beard turned gray, becoming a badass anime grandpa in the process. He swung his sword from top to bottom repeatedly until he was eventually able to slice through the air. However, even though he chose the path of the sword and became an aura master, he died once he achieved his goal due to his old age. Originally, this was a small Easter egg. Andreas wondered why they had introduced something like that because no one knew that he had ultimately succeeded in achieving his dream and becoming an aura master. In the meantime, the old man working in the cemetery had already started filling in the grave. Andreas continued to think about Nicol and wondered what would happen if he managed to create a dark knight from Nicol's body. Of course, he knew that even Sharon couldn't create a first-class dark knight in the present time. However, once Andreas further developed his character through evolution, it would no longer be a problem for him. So he wanted to start looking for a suitable body now, someone with the talent to become his subordinate. He approached the gravekeeper, who had just finished filling in the grave. The gravekeeper went on the offensive and asked Andreas if he wanted a different body. However, if that were the case, he would need Karen's permission first because he didn't have the right to arrange such a thing on his own. Andreas thought for a moment and asked if the gravekeeper would make an exception if he exchanged the body for his signet ring. Surprised and fascinated by the ring, the gravekeeper looked at it. He recognized that it was the seal of a count and realized that he could fetch a lot of money by selling it. He questioned whether he was truly willing to trade it for a body. Andreas told him that he had nothing else but this old ring and that he would gladly give it away since, as a mage, only the results of his experiments mattered to him. The gravekeeper, who had already made up his mind and was acting a bit, hesitated. However, when Andreas handed him the ring and assured him that he wouldn't tell Sharon about it, he was certain that the gravekeeper would give in, which he did, telling Andreas that he could have another body. Andreas knew that the ring was valuable, but the body meant more to him than any amount of gold. He thanked the gravekeeper and instructed him which grave to dig up. The moon shone particularly beautifully that night, casting a soft blue light upon the earth. When the gravekeeper finished, Andreas opened the coffin and examined Nicol's corpse. He was glad that the clear future he had seen yesterday through his character selection was slowly coming closer, and he was taking the first steps in that direction. Once he returned, he intended to begin his necromancer training immediately. With the images of his first subordinate in the background, Andreas still couldn't quite believe that he would soon become stronger. He definitely wanted to rely on his first subordinate. When Andreas returned to the laboratory, he had to start working right away. He placed the body he had to retrieve for Sharon on a table and realized that it was an ordinary, usable body. He had to take care of this body, prepare it. Moreover, he was responsible for it and would be punished if anything happened to it. Around him were more experiments and individual body parts, as well as tools. Andreas wasn't very pleased that he was being ordered around immediately upon his return. But he also knew that he worked better when annoyed, and he thought that his body would instinctively remember the work. He wore a leather mask and wiped the sweat from his forehead with one hand. He wanted to quickly finish the tedious work for Sharon and finally be able to start his studies. After preparing the corpse, he wiped away some blood while corpses still hung from the ceiling above him. He thought about Nickel in his suitcase and wondered if he would be able to use him at his level. He knew that at his level, he could only work with a skeleton. Andreas pondered whether his character trait would also affect his subordinates but was uncertain since he had never used this trait before. Additionally, he didn't have any money left to test it on another body beforehand. Suddenly, the chains clanged as they tensed. The vampire addressed Andreas once again, asking how long he intended to keep them waiting. Andreas looked back at the cage and replied that they weren't asleep as he had thought. The vampire emphasized that they had already sworn not to harm him and asked again if he wouldn't free them and if he wanted to toil for Sharon for the rest of his life. Andreas approached the cage, standing directly in front of her. He had been waiting for this conversation. With a hopeful look, the vampire asked if he was finally sane and would finally set them free. Andreas had always wondered how Sharon managed to capture and imprison such a vampire. But as he read the book, which he had to think about on the train, which was about vampires, he found the answer. The vampire wondered why he had been staring at her silently the whole time and asked why he was doing that. She also asked if he still had doubts. She told him to hurry up and make a decision, otherwise, she would kill him herself, even if he freed her. Andreas said that he would free her, to which she widened her eyes. He explained that he could no longer work for Sharon. Joyfully, she held out her handcuffs to him and asked if he would truly free her now. Andreas said that he would, but she would have to swear on the name of her family that she wouldn't harm him. Upon hearing this, she widened her eyes, and her body language changed. Andreas recognized from her reaction that the things described in the book were indeed true. He had read that a vampire who swore on the name of their family could not break that oath. Suddenly, Andreas also widened his eyes when the vampire agreed to his condition. She swore on the name of Lucifer. Andreas was surprised at how easily it went. When the vampire swore on the name of her family, a system window opened in front of Andreas, informing him that he had fulfilled certain conditions and that the system had found a species capable of evolving. The probability of the vampire Angela becoming Angela Lucifer was currently 55%. To Angela's surprise, Andreas fiddled with something in the system windows. Andreas wondered why he had the ability to evolve others as well, depending on whether they were his subordinates or not. The system window described the type of development and that the goal could be developed to a higher level. Furthermore, it directly asked him if he wanted to develop her or not. Andreas thought about taking the opportunity before using it on Nickel to see the effects of evolution. He also thought that even if something were to happen, he wouldn't be at fault. Angela asked him what he was waiting for and if he had deceived her and didn't actually want to set her free. In the system, he selected yes and decided to evolve Angela. She was completely shocked, and a stabbing pain ran through her body. She screamed in pain, holding her head and falling to the ground. Andreas looked on in astonishment at the spectacle unfolding before him. Angela could hardly bear the pain and gasped in agony. When she regained some semblance of consciousness, she asked Andreas what he had done. Another wave of pain filled her body, and she fainted back onto the floor. Andreas wondered what was happening as she lay unconscious down there. He said she should pull herself together because otherwise, he wouldn't know if the evolution was a success or a failure. Nevertheless, whether it had worked or not, he had learned something new about his character trait. If he could evolve beings that weren't his own subordinates, he could certainly evolve his own subordinates as well. He prepared Nickel on a table and intended to make him one of his subordinates. He smeared some blood on the ground again and drew a magic circle in the center, placing Nickel's body inside. Andreas prepared to summon him. He raised his hands to chest height above him and gathered the turquoise mist again, while staring at the skeleton summoning. Then a system window appeared, informing him that a corpse had been found that was also capable of practicing necromancy. Additionally, the system added another effect to the corpse. Andreas was completely surprised by the message and couldn't believe what he had read. In addition to the turquoise mist, a black, dark mist now appeared, swirling around the corpse. Nickel floated slightly above the ground. While Andreas continued to perform the ceremony, he realized that it took an immense amount of mana to summon a simple skeleton. Slowly, the skin detached from the bones of the corpse until only the bones remained visible. As the last bit of skin dissolved into thin air, the skeleton, completely enveloped in the turquoise mist, stood upright. Andreas, lying exhausted on the ground, watched in astonishment. The system informed him that the skeleton summoning was a success and that he had summoned a legendary level skeleton. Additionally, it notified him that his skeleton summoning spell had reached level 3. Andreas couldn't believe that it had worked. Furthermore, the system informed him that the skeleton had a very high level, granting him a series of advantages such as rank promotion and reclassification as a skeleton soldier. Moreover, it could recall certain things from its previous life. He looked at the skeleton and saw his status window next to it. Based on the status window and the sword mastery attribute, Andreas realized that Nickel had indeed been an aura master in his previous life. Subsequently, the skeleton communicated using sign language. Andreas explained to it that he was now its master and that he would take care of it and be responsible for it. The skeleton understood this, and Andreas felt confident about their future together. Once he returned to his room, he relaxed a bit. He looked at his calendar and knew that it would still take a year for Sharon to die. However, he also knew that there were still several things to be done by then. He opened the system window and checked his status. But first, Andreas wanted to summon his skeleton, so he got up and asked his system to summon the skeleton he had stored in another dimension for so long. It came through a blue portal to Andreas in his dimension. Andreas knew it would be bad if someone found his new friend, so he decided to give him some clothes first. It was a sunny day outside, and it was peaceful. The skeleton wore a black parka with a hood and a red scarf. Andreas thought it now looked like a real human, no matter how you looked at it. Suddenly, the skeleton began training with an imaginary sword. Andreas realized that the Easter egg description had not been a lie. He remembered the description that said Nickel had actually died during training and wanted to continue training even after his death. Then he smiled because it wasn't a bad thing for him. He clenched his fist and had finally found a way to train his character trait. Andreas called out Nickel's name, causing him to pause his training. He asked if Andreas could teach him the art of swordsmanship.